The wind carried more than snow that night. It carried a choice. A quiet seamstress opened her door to a wounded Lakota scout, bleeding and half-frozen on her step. By dawn, the gossiping town would call her a traitor, stones striking her shutters as fever raged inside. But when 80 mounted warriors rode in at sunrise, not to take vengeance but to give thanks, the lie was broken and a new truth forged. Out of danger, slander, and firelight care came a union no one expected, and a signboard carved by the very man she saved would mark the start of her true life. Snow fell like ash from a fire that would not die. The seamstress had worked her needle until her fingers cramped, then worked a little longer, because that was what a woman did when silence was her only company. Outside, the prairie moaned beneath the storm. The lamps guttered, shadows lengthened, and still she bent over the fabric spread across her lap. A dress promised to a rancher's wife in town, payment she needed if her little shop was to keep its door open another week. It was not the storm that stopped her hand, it was the knock. At first, she thought it must be a branch against the siding, some stray limb driven by the wind. Then it came again, heavier, desperate. She set the needle aside, rose, and crossed the narrow room to the door. When she opened it, the night itself seemed to fall inside. A man, no, scarcely more than a boy, collapsed forward across her threshold, half conscious. His hair was long, black, matted with blood. His breath came in ragged pulls, each one clouding the cold air between them. Across his chest, a crimson wound had soaked his buckskin. For a heartbeat she only stood there, the weight of choice hanging over her. She knew the patterns of gossip in this town. She had lived under them for years, a widow to a tradesman who left her more debt than coin. A woman alone was already suspect. A woman who harbored a Lakota scout would be condemned before sunrise. But his skin was ice, his lips blue, and death crouched at his shoulder. "Lord help me," she whispered, bending to drag him inside. His weight was more than her arms should have managed, yet desperation lent her strength. She pulled him to the pallet near her stove, stoking the fire high until its light painted the room in gold. She cut away the soaked leather, jaw tight as she saw the gash torn across his ribs. No lawman had done this. No, it was the work of frost and steel, some nameless skirmish out on the plains. She pressed cloth to the wound, steadying her hand though it trembled. The scout stirred, muttered in his tongue, and winced when her touch pressed too deeply. She could not understand his words, but she understood the fear in them. "Rest," she said, voice low but steady. "You're safe here. For tonight at least." She worked as she had with her needle, careful, meticulous, every thread of attention bent on the task. She boiled water, tore linen into strips, and pressed herbs from her scant stores. The hours stretched long, marked only by the hiss of wind outside and the labored rhythm of his breath. But mercy is never hidden long in a town too small for secrets. By the time dawn's pale edge slipped over the prairie, 2 men had already glimpsed her light burning late. By mid-morning, whispers crept like frost across every fence post and porch rail in town. The seamstress had taken in an Indian. By noon, the whispers carried weight. Traitor, sympathizer, godless woman. She felt it in the stairs when she stepped. Out to fetch more water, the hiss of voices that hushed when she passed. A stone struck her shutters before nightfall, sharp enough to make her flinch. Yet when she returned inside, the scout's fever had broken into sweat. His chest rose steadier, his color stronger. She cooled his brow and fed him broth with a spoon, watching his eyes flicker open, dark as midnight and sharp despite the weakness. He studied her in silence for a long moment, then touched his chest, murmuring a word she could not follow. He lifted his hand, pressed it awkwardly over his heart, and inclined his head. Gratitude, spoken without needing translation. She bowed her head, throat tight. That night, as snow hammered her little shop and the town's judgment grew heavier, She sat beside him, mending by firelight. The gossip was a storm she could not stop, but here, in this room, a different kind of truth was being stitched, thread by patient thread, fragile but strong. And somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the reach of rumor or stone, the prairie carried word to ears she did not know were listening. Riders moved beneath the winter stars, and they were not few. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. The storm had passed, but the quiet that followed felt sharper than the wind itself. The seamstress stepped onto her porch with a pail, boots crunching against snow crusted hard by nights. Cold. The town's dirt street was whitewashed, the rooftops hunched like weary shoulders. From the mercantile to the saloon, windows glinted with frost, and behind them, eyes. Every movement of her hand, every step she took, was measured by the weight of watching. She bent for water at the pump, felt the hush ripple across the street. Somewhere, a door slammed. Somewhere else, a voice muttered, low and cutting. By the time she carried the pail back inside, she already knew the truth. Her act of mercy had crossed the invisible line the town guarded with its own kind of law. Inside, the scout stirred at the sound of the latch. His face was drawn but clearer, the fever's grip slackening. She knelt beside him, holding the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, his eyes not leaving hers, as if he could read the cost she had already paid. "Better," she said softly. "You'll be better still." He touched his chest again, repeated the word he had spoken the night before. It fell heavy, melodic, carrying meaning she could only guess at. Gratitude, perhaps. Or a vow. The scrape of hooves outside broke the moment. She crossed quickly to the window, pulled back the curtain, a finger's width. A rancher rode by, his face set hard beneath his hat. Behind him, another man, her late husband's creditor, lingered longer, eyes narrowing at her door. They did not stop. They didn't need to. The threat was in the way they looked. By mid-morning she heard it plain, children calling names, stones clattering against her shutters. She sat with her sewing, jaw tight, refusing to let her hands tremble. Each strike of rock on wood was a reminder of the price she paid for keeping him alive. And yet, she did not falter. When the scout's wound bled again, she tore another strip from her own apron, pressing it firmly. When he shivered, she added logs to the fire, though her pile dwindled low. When he closed his eyes in pain, she hummed, soft, wordless hymns her mother had sung long ago, until his breathing steadied. It was late afternoon when the knock came again. She froze, blood quick in her ears. But this time, it was no stranger. Rancher, broad-shouldered, with dust on his coat and kindness in his weathered eyes, stood at the door. He tipped his hat, hesitated before speaking. "I heard the talk," he said. "Didn't sit right with me." His gaze flicked past her shoulder, catching the glow of firelight and the outline of a man on her pallet. His jaw tightened, but he did not recoil. "I know what they're saying. I also know what a life's worth." Relief, fierce and unexpected, broke in her chest. She stepped aside. "Then help me." Together, they worked through the evening. He fetched water, steadied her hands as she cleaned the wound again. His voice was steady, offering words when hers failed. When the scout moaned, the rancher pressed him firmly against the bedding, whispering something low, calming, as though speaking to one of his own cattle in pain. By the time darkness crept back, the fever had ebbed further. The scout's eyes opened wider, focused, alive. The rancher leaned back, wiping his brow. "He'll see morning." That's more than most would have given him. The seamstress sank to her knees, weary, grateful. She looked from the scout to the rancher, then toward the shuttered window where another stone struck sharply in the night. The world outside was closing in, but inside, 3 lives now bent toward the same fragile fire. What none of them yet knew was that firelight was visible from the hills, and warriors already traced its glow against the snow. The town's whispers grew louder than the church bell. By the third day, mercy had become a crime in the eyes of her neighbors. The seamstress felt it in every glance that lingered too long, every voice that hushed when she stepped into the street. What began as mutters had turned to open scorn. At the well, a woman she once called a friend pulled her bucket away without a word. At the mercantile, coins were taken from her hand as if tainted. The rancher at her side, stubborn in his loyalty, met each look with his own hard stare, but he could not shield her from all of it. Rumors changed shape as they traveled. Some said she was harboring an outlaw. Others whispered she had married the scout in secret, forsaking her own kind. By week's end, children trailed after her door, shouting names sharp as stones. Inside, the scout's wound mended slowly but surely. His strength returned in inches, not strides. He could sit now, propped by blankets, his gaze steady and unflinching. When she sewed by firelight, he watched with quiet intensity, as if trying to learn her world the way she had once learned. Stitches from her mother. It was the rancher who bore the brunt of the defense. When a group of men gathered outside one night, muttering threats, it was his voice that cut through. "Any of you throw another stone at her window, you'll answer to me." The crowd dispersed, but their words lingered, heavy with warning. Later, when the house was quiet again, the seamstress turned to him. "You've no reason to stand with me in this." He shook his head. "No reason but the right one." She looked at the scout then, his eyes gleaming in firelight, the lines of pain etched deep, but not breaking him. For the first time, she wondered if her act of mercy had bound more lives together than she had intended. The days blurred into one another. Snow melted to mud, gossip to venom. One evening, returning from the pump, she found a crude mark scratched across her door, "Traitor." Her hands trembled, but she did not cry. She carried the water inside, set it down, and went to her sewing. The rancher patched the shutters where stones had split the wood. The scout lifted the spoon she offered him and swallowed broth, slow but certain. It was in these small acts, water drawn, shutters mended, stitches sewn, that defiance lived. And still, beneath the surface, the prairie held its secret. For far. Across the snow line, riders moved in silence. The scout's people had not lost him. They had been watching, waiting. 80 strong, they camped by the frozen river, weighing whether the woman's mercy was a trap or a truth. The decision would come at dawn, when hooves thundered against the edge of town. The fire crackled loud enough to cover what the heart could not say. The seamstress sat close to the stove that evening, needle in hand, though her stitches wavered. The rancher leaned against the wall, hat in his lap, watching the scout, breathe steady in the dim glow. Outside, the wind scoured the shutters with a restless scrape, but inside, silence pressed harder than any storm. It was the scout who broke it. His voice, rough, halting, formed words in English. "You saved." Her head lifted, startled. Until then, his words had been only in his tongue, gestures carrying the weight. Now, with effort, he spoke hers. "You saved," he repeated, hand rising to touch his side. Why? The question sank deeper than the wound itself. She laid her sewing aside, folding her hands in her lap. "Because I could not shut the door." She hesitated, then added, "My husband used to say a closed door is the same as a grave. He died in debt." But those words stayed. The scout studied her, dark eyes unreadable. Slowly he nodded, as if filing the truth into some hidden ledger of his own. The rancher shifted, the lines in his face drawn tight. "They don't see it that way out there," he said, jerking his chin toward the town. "Mercy to them looks like betrayal." She met his gaze. "And to you?" His silence was answer enough. Later, when the scout drifted back to sleep, the rancher spoke again, voice low so only she could hear. "They're not just angry, they're scared. Anything they don't understand, they call a threat. And if they can't push you down, they'll burn you out. Her chest tightened. She thought of the mark on her door, the stones against her shutters, the way once familiar eyes now turned to knives. She wanted to believe she could outlast it, but her voice cracked when she asked, "And will you stand when they come?" His hand closed into a fist around his hat brim. "I've stood through blizzards and stampedes. I'll stand through this." The firelight caught the truth in his eyes, steady and unflinching. For the first time in years, warmth that was not from. The stove settled deep in her chest. It was not love yet, but it was something just as dangerous, trust. That night, she dreamed not of stones or slurs, but of riders cresting the hill at dawn. Faces painted, feathers streaming, hooves drumming thunder into the earth. In the dream, they did not come for blood, but for her, eyes fixed, gifts in hand, words carried on the wind like absolution. When she woke, the fire had gone low. The scout's breathing was easier. And the rancher, still sitting near the door, had fallen asleep in the chair, boots planted firm as if, even in rest, he kept watch. She wrapped a quilt over his shoulders before returning to her sewing. For the first time, the silence of the room did not feel empty. But silence outside was another matter. In that silence, the riders were drawing nearer. The knock at the door sounded like a verdict. It came at dusk, when the sky was bruised purple and the last light bent low across the snow. The seamstress froze with her hands in the wash basin. The rancher was already on his feet, jaw set, hat pulled low. The scout straightened on his pallet, alert despite the wound that kept him tethered. The knock came again, harder, sharper. She opened the door a crack, heart pounding. 3 men stood there, shoulders broad beneath their coats, faces carved from suspicion and disdain. The one in front was the creditor who had once threatened to seize her shop for unpaid bills. His eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. "You've kept him long enough," he said. "We know who he is. A scout, a spy, a danger to every soul in this town." Her throat tightened. "He's hurt. He's no danger to anyone." The creditor sneered. "Every Indian's a danger, and the longer you harbor him, the more you prove you're one of them. If you won't hand him over, we'll take him." The rancher stepped forward, boots grinding into the porch. "You'll do no such thing," his voice cut like steel. "You want to throw stones, you do it from the shadows. But if you mean to lay a hand on her door, you'll answer to me." The men shifted, anger tightening their jaws, but none moved closer. The creditor spat into the snow. "You've thrown your lot in with her. Don't cry when you're dragged down with the rest." They left, but their words lingered, sour and heavy. Inside, the seamstress sagged against the wall, trembling. "They'll come back, stronger." The rancher nodded grimly. "A mob, or worse. They'll want to make an example." The scout's voice, low and halting, broke the silence. "My people," he said, pressing his hand to his chest. "They come." She turned to him, startled. "How do you know?" He touched his temple, then pointed east, where the horizon darkened against the fading light. His eyes held certainty. The rancher gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "If that's true, maybe 80 riders is the only thing that'll cool this town's temper." The seamstress swallowed hard. The thought of mounted warriors storming into town carried as much fear as hope. Would they come with vengeance or with thanks? That night, the shop felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. The shutters were barred, lamps turned low. The rancher sat with his rifle across his knees. The scout dozed fitfully, hand never straying far from the knife at his side. The seamstress mended by firelight, though her hands shook. Each stitch felt like defiance, a refusal to surrender to fear. Outside, the town grew restless. Men gathered. At the saloon, their voices carrying on the cold air. Horses stamped in the street waiting. By midnight, the first stone shattered against her window, spilling glass across the floor. She flinched, but the rancher was already on his feet, rifle aimed, his voice roaring out into the night. "The next man throws, he won't walk away." The street fell silent, but silence was no comfort. It only meant they were waiting for daylight. She sat beside the scout, brushing damp hair from his brow. His eyes flicked open, fierce despite the weakness in his body. He reached for her hand, gripped it tight. "Dawn," he whispered. "They come." And somehow, in his voice, the word did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. Dawn crept in like a blade drawn from its sheath. The horizon was still gray when the town gathered. Hooves stamped the frozen street, men's breath fogging as they clustered outside her shop. Rifles glinted in the half-light, and voices rose sharp with fear and anger. The seamstress stood inside with her back against the door, pulse hammering. The rancher loaded his rifle with slow, deliberate care, eyes never leaving the window. The scout sat upright now, wrapped in blankets. Strength seeping back into his frame, the creditor's voice rang out above the others. "This ends today. Hand him over, or we'll burn this place to the ground." The rancher pushed the door open a crack, his voice cutting cold. "You'll not touch a hair on her head. Not while I stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Anger, doubt, thirst for violence. They had come expecting weakness, not defiance. Stones clattered against the siding, shattering another pane. A torch was lit, its flame snapping in the wind. The seamstress felt her knees weaken. If the torch met her door, her little shop would vanish in fire before the sun had cleared the hills. Then the scout's voice, quiet but firm, broke through. "No burn." He rose, slow, trembling, but upright. He pressed his hand against the wound at his side and stepped toward the door. His eyes locked on hers, steady and unyielding. "Open," he said. She shook her head, panic rising. "They'll kill you." His gaze softened, a quiet strength in it. "Trust." The rancher's jaw worked as though grinding stone, but at last he eased the latch. The door swung wide, revealing the crowd, their faces lit by fire and fury. The scout stepped into the threshold, bareheaded, wounded, but standing proud. The murmur hushed into silence. Even the torchbearer faltered. The creditor snarled, "Look at him! He's no friend. He's the reason we bury sons." But before the words could swell into violence, a new sound cut across the street. Hooves, first faint, then thunderous, rolling like a storm down from the hills. The ground itself seemed to tremble. Every face turned toward the horizon. The seamstress clutched the frame of her door, eyes wide. Across the snow line they appeared. Row upon row of riders cresting the ridge, painted faces and eagle feathers streaming, lances flashing in the morning sun. 80 strong. The mob froze, torches lowering, rifles drooping in stunned silence. The creditor's mouth went dry, words dying in his throat. The scout straightened, shoulders squared despite the blood at his side. His voice rang out, clear and strong, words in his own tongue, carried on the cold air like a battle cry. But what followed was not war. The riders slowed as they entered town, their chief at the lead. He raised his hand, not in threat, but in greeting. His eyes swept over the gathered crowd, then fixed on the seamstress, standing just behind the scout. In that moment, the weight of gossip, stones, and slurs fell away. Dawn had brought a reckoning, though not the one the town had expected. The silence of 80 riders weighed heavier than 1,000 shouts. The Lakota chief dismounted, boots striking the frozen earth with deliberate calm. Behind him, the line of mounted warriors waited, lances upright, horses snorting in the pale morning light. The crowd of townsfolk shrank back, torches guttering low. The seamstress gripped the doorframe, her breath caught in her throat. The scout stepped forward, swaying but proud, and the rancher stood firm beside him, rifle still in hand. The chief's gaze swept over the street before fixing on the wounded scout. He spoke in their tongue, words rolling deep and sonorous. "The," scout answered, voice rough but strong, and for a long moment the two men held each other's eyes as if the world beyond them had vanished. Then the chief turned, his attention falling on her. The crowd braced, expecting wrath. Some stepped back, others tightened their grips on rifles. But instead of anger, the chief bowed his head. He lifted a pouch from his belt and held it out with both hands. The scout translated, voice halting but clear. He says, "You gave life back. You opened your door when cold and death waited. For this, he brings thanks. For this, he brings medicine." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Confusion, disbelief. The seamstress's hands shook as she accepted the pouch. Inside were roots, herbs, and small carved figures polished smooth. Not payment, not a bribe, a gift of honor. The creditor's face twisted. "Don't be fooled. They'll bleed us dry yet." But the rancher's voice cut him off, sharp as a whip crack. "Enough." He stepped forward, rifle cradled but ready. "You've slandered her long enough. You called her a traitor when all she did was show more decency than the rest of you combined. Look around. Do you see vengeance here? Do you see fire and war? No. You see gratitude. You see what she bought with courage when the rest of you hid behind stones." The crowd faltered, eyes shifting, shame creeping into their faces. The seamstress stood frozen, heat rising in her cheeks. She had expected stones, not defense. Yet the rancher's voice did not waver. "And if any man still calls her a traitor, he'll answer to me." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. At last, the creditor lowered his gaze, his bluster crumbling. One by one, the rest of the men drifted back, mutters hollow now, their anger stripped bare. The chief raised his hand once more, speaking final words. The scout turned, eyes soft when they found hers. He says, "You are a sister now. This town may forget, but we will not." Her throat tightened, tears burning. She bowed her head, clutching the pouch to her chest. The rancher took a step closer, his voice low enough for her alone. "You've braved worse than any of us, and I'll not see you stand alone another day." He reached into his coat, pulling something small, glinting in the dawn. A simple band, his mother's ring. He dropped to one knee, not caring that the street, the town, and 80 warriors all bore witness. "Marry me," he said, steady as stone. "Let them call us what they will. I'll call you mine." The seamstress's breath caught, shock rippled through the townsfolk. But in the chief's eyes, there was only calm approval. The scout's lips curved into the faintest smile. Her hands trembled as she reached out, as if the choice had already been written in the firelight of nights past. "Yes," she whispered. The crowd stirred, and for once, no voice rose in protest. The hammering of hooves faded, but the sound of it lingered like a promise. By the time the sun had climbed fully over the ridge, the warriors had departed, leaving only the hush of snow settling over the street. The chief's gift remained, in her hands, and with it, a new weight, the kind that steadies rather than crushes. The townsfolk drifted back to their homes, whispers softened now, no stones hurled, no torches raised. Shame clung to their shoulders heavier than pride. What had begun as slander was unraveling into silence, and silence, in time, would turn into apology. The rancher still stood at her side, the ring now a bright circle around her finger. He didn't boast, didn't gloat, only tipped his hat to the retreating crowd, as though daring them to speak again. None did. Inside, the scout sank back onto the pallet, strength waning after the effort of standing against the mob. Yet his eyes gleamed with something more than survival. He reached for the small knife at his belt, motioned for a scrap of pine wood the rancher fetched from the pile. With slow, deliberate strokes, he carved. The seamstress sat close, watching. The curls of wood full. His hands, though stiff from pain, worked steadily. At last he held it out, a sign, rough but true, etched with her name and a single word, seamstress. Her throat caught as she traced the grooves with her fingertips. Not just a token, but a shield, a statement. She had a place here, marked by the very life she had saved. Weeks passed. The fever broke entirely, and the wound closed. The scout rode on with his people, leaving the sign nailed firmly above her door. Business returned, and with it, respect that had once been stolen by rumor. The townsfolk brought mending again, coins in hand, eyes lowered in awkward gratitude. The rancher kept his word, standing with her each day. Where once she stitched alone, now she stitched beside the man who fetched firewood, carried bolts of fabric, and laughed softly when her needle pricked his thumb. Their evenings were filled with small domestic quiet, bread baking, mended seams, a fire that no longer felt like a defense, but a hearth. And when children's laughter spilled from the street, chasing winter's chill with spring's warmth, she knew the town had changed, not fully, not easily, but enough. On a night when death pressed close, one woman chose mercy instead of fear. For it, she bore stones, slander, and near ruin. But at dawn, when 80 warriors came to thank her, the truth could no longer be denied. In the harsh country of the frontier, it was not wealth nor weapon that saved her. It was the courage to keep a door open, and from that choice, a family, a future, and a name carved in wood were born. This story made history, and may it ride with you tonight.